Just on the topic of US propaganda, just to kind of do more of a deep dive into a specific area where, there is a blanket kind of coverage in one direction, which is the really negative and unchallenged US propaganda narrative against the DPRK. We recently had a guest from No Tudol, and they debunked a lot of the myths that there are about North Korea in terms of starvation, depiction of the country as warmongering and belligerent, and also highlighted the historical ties that there are between China and North Korea. So could you offer us some insight into the current relationship between these countries, and how much is China able to counter the crippling US sanctions? And in terms of this, in the context of China having completed its poverty alleviation program in recent years, so I wonder if you could reflect on that for us.
Yeah, so again, very, very rich question. The relations between Korea and China go back millennia. You could actually say that the reason why China itself was colonized was a result of the Sino-Japanese War, which most people may or may not know. It was fought in 1894, but it was fought on the Korean Peninsula. The Japanese were beginning their colonization of Korea. There were factions in the Korean government that did not want Japanese colonization. One of them was the wife of the last emperor of Korea. Her name was Myeongseong Hwanghu, the Empress Myeongseong. And she was a kind of, if you will, a Korean proto-feminist. She sent her cousin to the West, came back. Cousin told her, we're in a bad place. The West is advanced. And she understood that it was time for Korea to modernize, but they also needed to prevent it from being colonized. And Japan had already gotten its claws into Korea, and it was going the way of the Western colonial powers. They had taken on, Bismarck, the model of Bismarckian Germany, adapted their military strategies and technology, and they were beginning to expand in Asia as a colonial power, very much in the way of the Western colonial powers. So the Empress Myeongseong was deeply opposed to Japanese colonization, and she was trying to balance with the other powers that were vying for access to the Korean Peninsula. Because if you look at Korea, it's like literally a little stepping stone onto China, and all the imperial powers understood that China was the big prize that they wanted, including Japan itself. Japan has always attacked China by way of Korea. So I'm getting very long-winded here. But anyway, Myeongseong Hwanghu was slaughtered. She was attacked by 60 Japanese samurai in the imperial palace, and she was gang raped and then set on fire while she was still alive, doused with kerosene and set on fire. And so that was the beginning of the Japanese relationship with Korea. And then later, when the Japanese came into Korea, they took one of the summer palaces, the Changyang Palace, and they turned it into a zoo and filled it with monkeys. So I think that gives you a sense of, what the colonial agenda was. But during this period, the anti-Japanese Korean leadership appealed to China for help. And so China responded and sent troops to help liberate the capital that was being overrun with pro-Japanese counter-revolutionaries. And because of this, the Japanese claimed that China had broken an agreement not to station troops, and they waged a war on the Korean Peninsula. And as a result of this war, Taiwan province was ceded to Japan as war booty. And then a large part of China called the Liaodong Peninsula was also given over to Japan. And then it was also the beginning of the colonization of Korea. So the colonization of Korea and the colonization of China are a dovetail with each other. And in 1919, Millions of Koreans rose up in nonviolent protest against the Japanese colonization. It was, probably the largest nonviolent mobilization in human history at that time. And of course, what happened was that everybody was massacred. Tens of thousands of people were massacred. And so at that point, the Koreans who were resisting Japanese colonization went in multiple directions, but there was a significant group that went north to northern China, what was then referred to as Manchuria, and they started guerrilla warfare against the Japanese. And so this was among these guerrilla leaders, there was a man who was kind of the Che Guevara of these guerrilla warfare in that region. His name was Kim Il-sung. These irregular forces then later joined up with the precursors to the Chinese People Liberation Army, and they fought in Manchuria against the Japanese and helped liberate China from the Japanese. And so there were entire divisions of Korean fighters that fought for the liberation of China. And then having helped China win back its liberation, they went back to North Korea. And then not very long after, a war broke out on the peninsula because the US had prevented the Koreans from creating their own state. And then so China sent again, as a redux of 1894, sent troops to support Korea, or in this case, North Korea, against the Western invasion. So that relationship is so deep and so tight that people don't understand how extraordinary that relationship it is. But just to give you a few, anecdotes, there was a moment when Kim Jong-un, the current leader, had to travel in order to meet with Donald Trump. And if I'm not mistaken, this was in Vietnam. And when he did this, he took the train. He usually rides in a kind of a slow armored train. And so he had to go from, North Korea all the way across China and then into Southeast Asia. And this happened at the period which was the most important public holiday of China, when everybody, when 500 million people are taking trains going to their hometown. And what China did was it stopped that migration so that Kim's train could go through. It was literally Moses parting the sea in order that he could do his diplomatic business. So this is one signal of, the kind of respect that China accords its relationship with North Korea and the North Korean leader. And North Korea is the only country that China has a mutual defense treaty with. It has no mutual defense treaties with any other countries. It is the only country that to this day it still has a defense treaty with, mutual defense treaty. So a war against North Korea is a war against China and vice versa. So I think that, just gives you a sense. But anyway, when they greeted him recently, a few years back, they quoted a classical Korean text called Yongbyo Changa. It means, dragon flies up to the heavens. And it's one of the most important texts in the Korean language, bar none. It is literally the text of the Korean language. It's the first text that was ever written in the Korean language. And it starts out by saying, a tree that has deep roots will not be destroyed in a drought, nor will it bend in the wind. And when they said this, they read this text as they were addressing the meeting with Kim Jong-un, which is a kind of a deep affirmation of the legitimacy of North Korea, as well as its resilience and power and their deep respect for it. So anybody who tells you anything different, is reading from the US propaganda line. They would like you to believe that North Korea is a propagandized carceral, one large concentration camp, and everybody's just raving to rush out of it. But no, it is a deeply militarized state, and they've had to do that. It's built like a maroon society. Maroon societies are, societies that were built by escaped slaves. So they have a deep kind of discipline, which involves a kind of a capacity and willingness to fight for their existence. But it is not the dystopian hellhole that the West would like you to believe that it is, although they have tried very, very hard to turn it into that. Just one more, little anecdote or data point. Until 1979, North Korea was richer and more developed than South Korea. And it was referred to by the Cambridge economist as the Korean miracle. The Korean miracle until 1979 was North Korea, not South.